Edward looked pale on the day of his trial. After all, he had spent nearly a month in prison because of various delays, but his face radiated determination and calm. His meeting with the Queen had somewhat eased his nerves. The embarrassment and the uncertainty of how to meet her gaze had faded away. Though Nicolette sat with Duke Croy on a side balcony in the courtroom, Edward spared her only a single glance. He gave her a slight nod of acknowledgement but otherwise refused to let her presence distract him. Similarly, he paid no attention to the curious nobles who filled the courtroom. His focus was solely on those who would speak that day, the judge, the royal prosecutor, and his own lawyer. The royal prosecutor cleared his throat and opened the proceedings by reading the charges against him. "We have gathered here before the face of God, the royal court, and Her Majesty Queen Nicolette Pawn to address the case of the accused, Edward Sandcreek, charged with high treason." He thwarted the arrest of Rector Audrine Boucher, who, along with the dangerous radical Camille Desmoulins, conspired against the crown and aided his escape from the island. Given these turbulent times, the prosecution proposes an exemplary punishment, the death penalty, as only such a measure can restore order and justice in the kingdom of Le Pédécine. Edward was then given the opportunity to testify. He looked at the judge and, in a clear, steady voice, addressed him, "Your Honor, Rector Audrine Boucher was my teacher, friend, and longtime mentor. I admit to aiding his escape, but I never intended to harm the crown. I was unaware of any conspiracy. I did not attend any meeting with Camille Desmoulins, nor did I know about it. I assumed the guards were coming for the rector merely because of some general statements he had made. I believed that our homeland was losing the freedom and progress for which this island had long been renowned. I thought I was saving an innocent man, a man I always respected, who was in danger for his opinions alone. I had no knowledge of any specific actions he took toward staging a coup in this country." Edward's lawyer now stood and addressed the judge. "I would like to call the first witness, who can confirm that the accused, Edward Sandcreek, was not present at the meeting with the agitator, Desmoulins." The royal prosecutor cleared his throat. "That won't be necessary. We have a fairly complete list of individuals who attended that secret meeting. Mr. Sandcreek's name is not on it, and his presence or absence at the meeting is not the subject of today's proceedings. The prosecution acknowledges that the accused was not at the meeting. However, Mr. Sandcreek directly defied a royal order, acted against the king's will and the interests of the monarchy, and we are here to examine his personal motives for this betrayal." "On what basis did you act, Mr. Sandcreek?" "I believed I was led by God's voice," Edward replied. "I felt compelled to help the rector, and I had peace about it. I doubt that the God who commands submission to rulers in his word would personally lead someone to rebel against the king he himself appointed," the prosecutor countered. "Objection," Edward's lawyer interjected. "According to the Bible, God anointed David as king while the rejected King Saul was still on the throne. We are not here to judge God's intentions, however, but to determine whether Mr. Sandcreek acted with malicious intent or not. I can call several witnesses to testify to his character and truthfulness. Mr. Sandcreek is a devoted Christian who has long served as an assistant preacher in one of the local congregations and enjoys a good reputation both in the church and at the university, where he recently worked as a teacher. Edward Sandcreek helped the rector escape by disguising him as an old woman," the prosecutor reminded the lawyer. "That is a deliberate act requiring preparation. The accused must have known the rector was in danger. He portrays his actions as a spontaneous response to a dangerous situation, but he had to have planned it carefully. I presume he didn't regularly wander the university halls with a bundle of women's clothing just in case." A few people in the courtroom chuckled softly at the remark, and even Queen Nicolette looked amused. Edward nodded. "I received a message," he admitted reluctantly, "that the rector was to be arrested. I was at home at the time and had only moments to decide what to do. I had an overwhelming inner conviction that I needed to act. The idea of a disguise came to me. I gathered some clothing from my late mother's belongings and headed to the university. When I saw the guards, I took a side corridor to get ahead of them and led the rector out of his office. That's the plain, unembellished truth." "So, you admit you acted in full knowledge against the king's orders?" the prosecutor asked. "Full knowledge is a strong term, sir," Edward replied. I didn't have 2 hours to think it through or gather more information. I acted under the impression that one of our country's fundamental freedoms of expression, which we've always prided ourselves on, was crumbling, and I had no idea that Audrine Boucher was plotting a coup. What was in that message? The prosecutor pressed. Instead of answering, Edward Sandcreek reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper he had kept with him the entire time. The prosecutor glanced at it. And based on these 2 unsigned sentences about the king's guards preparing to arrest the rector, you decided to help him? He shook his head. Though this story seems plausible, and we have witnesses ready to testify to your character, I have doubts about this testimony. A man will do anything to save his own neck, and nothing would be easier than to invent such an excuse after the fact, scribble a note, and deny any intentional guilt in the matter. Edward didn't know how to respond and looked at his lawyer. I would like to call witnesses to testify to Mr. Sandcreek's character. The lawyer repeated his earlier request, as he could think of nothing better. The prosecutor, however, wasn't ready to abandon the idea that the message was a fabricated excuse. Who will corroborate this story about the message? He asked. At that moment, Queen Nicolette stood and declared in a clear voice, I will corroborate it. She saw that the proceedings were taking a bad turn and sensed it was time to intervene. After all, this was a capital case, and the prosecutor, it seemed, was starting to gain the upper hand. Nicolette descended the steps from the balcony and approached the prosecutor. I wrote that message, she said calmly. And I had several reasons for doing so. The first and most important thing I must mention is that the king discussed the meeting with Camille Desmoulins with the elderly Count de Valpenson, who mumbles terribly. At the time they were discussing this betrayal, I thought they were talking about the journalist Desmarais, who, as far as I know, wrote about the revolution very impartially. So, I found the reaction unwarranted and excessive. Like Mr. Sandcreek, I believed that the fundamental freedoms of our country were crumbling and that severe punishments were being discussed for someone merely analyzing the political situation with an honest journalist. That was my first reason and my personal mistake. The second reason I dared to act against the king's decision was that, in the last month before his death, the king was occasionally unwell, moody, and overreacted to many things. I assumed this was another such overreaction. I presume I'm the last person you could accuse of not having the monarchy's best interests at heart. Though I misunderstood the situation due to my mistake, I don't regret my decision. I believe it is not, and should not be, in the kingdom's interest to execute intellectuals, whether it's Mr. Boucher or Mr. Sandcreek. However, I'm relieved that the rector has left our island and can no longer plot here. And for Mr. Sandcreek, I propose an acquittal. He acted based on something I set in motion. It's not clear to me, Your Majesty, why you chose to send that message specifically to Mr. Sandcreek, the prosecutor ventured to remark. The Queen nodded and began to explain. By chance, I knew where he lived. Some time ago, I had his address looked up because I wanted to write to him about an entirely different matter. And I knew that 2 of his first books were dedicated to Mr. Boucher. He was the only person who came to mind and whom I could turn to. Very well, thank you, Your Majesty, the prosecutor nodded. The prosecution acknowledges Her Majesty's testimony and her endorsement of the message and is willing to accept that Mr. Sandcreek is not lying when he claims he acted with good intentions. Edward gave a slight smile, but at that moment, Duke Croix rose from his seat. As the Queen's guardian, I would also like to say a few words. The Queen returned to her seat while Duke Croix descended from the balcony and fixed Edward with a stern look. If I've understood correctly, Duke Croix began slowly, Mr. Sandcreek has admitted here to rebelling against the king's will. The very word rebel carries the seed of insurrection, regardless of any mitigating circumstances, and I don't deny them. We are still dealing with a very real act of resistance against an order issued by the king himself. Her Majesty Queen Nicolette is not yet of age. The age difference between you two is 12 years, if I'm not mistaken. Perhaps this disparity would be more striking if Her Majesty were 8 years old and you were 20. Be that as it may, you are an adult and bear full responsibility for your decisions. Just as no adult thief can excuse himself by saying an 8-year-old child led him to steal, in my opinion, Queen Nicolette's involvement in this matter is not decisive. Therefore, I stand with the prosecution and propose an exemplary punishment." A hush fell over the courtroom. Edward realized his brief moment of relief had been premature. Duke Croix's words had turned the proceedings against him, and things began to look bleak again. He didn't know what to say. His lawyer stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the defense requests a reconsideration of the charge. I am convinced that strong reasons have been presented to show that this is not a case of high treason or a deliberate rebellion against the monarchy. Rather, the issue is the degree to which this was defiance of the king's will. In my opinion, this amounts to undermining the king's authority." The prosecutor eyed the lawyer narrowly but then nodded. "The prosecution agrees." Edward looked at the judge thoughtfully. "Your Honor, in the rapid sequence of events, I didn't have time to consider the legal consequences of my actions or what I was committing, nor whether I would be caught. I knew I was acting against the king's will, but I believed the fundamental freedoms of this country were at stake. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I don't wish to prolong this matter with further arguments. I would like to plead guilty. I refuse to admit to deliberate treason, but it would be pointless to deny that I knowingly acted against the king's authority, and to that, I plead guilty." Silence fell over the room. The prosecutor approached the judge, and they spoke quietly for a moment. Their gazes shifted between Edward and Duke Croix, who had by then returned to his seat beside the young queen. Nicolette pointedly ignored him. She focused on the proceedings in the courtroom. She knew the Duke would lecture her later, but she didn't want to give him the chance to start now. Edward studied the floor. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. For the first time, he admitted to himself that he was truly guilty. Was it possible that this was indeed the path God had nudged him toward? Though he felt peace, he couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of shame and embarrassment. He felt his face flush. The judge finally prepared to deliver the verdict. Edward bit his lip and hesitantly raised his head. "Mr. Sandcreek, you have been found guilty of undermining the king's authority. I hereby sentence you to public disgrace, corporal punishment, and exile. In light of mitigating circumstances, your prior good conduct, and your good reputation, I impose the lightest possible sentence, 20 lashes and a 1-year ban on entering the territory of Le Pays. Edward nodded and said nothing. His lawyer gave a slight bow to the judge and spoke on his behalf. "The defense accepts the sentence and has no further objections." Duke Croix looked at the Queen and said, loudly enough for others to hear, "As your guardian, I expressly forbid you from mitigating this sentence in any manner, or from exercising the prerogative to grant clemency to criminals under specified conditions." Nicolette didn't respond. Instead, she stood angrily and was the first to leave the courtroom. The trial concluded. The judge rose, and the guards began placing shackles on Edward to escort him back to prison. The prosecutor looked at Edward and couldn't resist one final jab. "Do you still believe God led you to do something like this?" Edward met his eyes and shrugged. "To be honest, I'm not entirely sure of myself right now," he replied quietly. "But on a rainy morning, it sometimes doesn't seem like the sun could come out in the afternoon. That's why they say, don't judge the day before evening." The prosecutor shook his head but said nothing more. He was accustomed to encountering defiance, anger, curses, and feelings of injustice from the convicted. Edward's mild response caught him off guard, and he left the courtroom that day deep in thought.